Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on the existence of a minimum wage. A minimum wage is a set value that any worker above a certain age must be paid per hour of work. To be paid anything under the amount is illegal. The key idea behind a minimum wage is that it prevents exploitation and leads to better living standards for the lowest earners in society. As with all political issues, however, there are those who both disagree with the minimum wage on principle and believe it does more harm than good. Today, we will unpick and compare these opinions. Firstly, there are those who argue on principle a minimum wage is necessary to protect workers. Many minority and marginalised groups lack the bargaining power to push for more equal wages, meaning that a government-imposed minimum wage is essential. The free market does not work as intended to some and can lead to exploitation of workers who have no power. Furthermore, put simply, a minimum wage means workers have more money than they would likely otherwise. The fact that a minimum wage exists is proof that without one, workers would not be paid enough. Therefore, the minimum wage ensures that every worker has enough to live above the poverty line, meaning that they have enough money to buy the bare essentials at least. Now, with this minimum wage, firms will likely have to spend more money. As such, there is now an incentive to cut costs elsewhere. Instead of simply paying workers less, as was the case in, say, the 1800s, firms are now incentivized to cut production costs overall, which both benefits the firm and consumers, given that lower costs will likely lead to lower prices. There is also a positive impact on the labour force. With firms now providing people with a minimum wage, many different jobs will all pay the same. This means that there will not be a scenario where workers are constantly being replaced with people who would be willing to work for less. This provides more job security to those in the labour market. Furthermore, with higher wages being paid to the lowest earners, the government has to spend less on benefits and other welfare payments because there is more disposable income for workers, meaning they can now afford these things themselves. There is also an increased incentive to go to work if the pay is higher, which further reduces government expenditure. Then, if all workers are paid the same minimal amount, this means that there is less inequality in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, etc. Everyone receives the same base rate of income. Furthermore, minority groups are more likely to be in lower paid positions than white people, meaning that with a higher minimum wage, there will be even more equality within the workforce. Let's finish this side of the debate with the morality of a minimum wage. Essentially, there is a view that in modern Western liberal democracies, we have a requirement to help everyone in society. This means imposing minimum wages to ensure every worker can eat and sleep soundly. Everyone has the right to the basics in society, and that starts with being able to afford the most basic of things. Now, for those who oppose the minimum wage, firstly, there is a viewpoint that the minimum wage is artificial and bad. Some argue that the minimum wages are detrimental to workers and the wider economy. They argue that the market should be the determining factor in people's wages, just as it is for every wage above the minimum amount. Some stress that messing with the market will do more harm than good. With a minimum wage, the cost of labour to firms increases. This results in higher prices for consumers, also known as cost-push inflation. These higher prices make it harder for people to afford even the most basic necessities, thus increasing poverty. Even with a minimum wage, some people simply don't work enough hours to merit the cost to inflation regarding increased wages. Small businesses also rely on cheap labour. For example, a service station relies on minimum wage employees to work the tills. With a minimum wage, these companies now have to pay more for their employees than without a minimum wage. If the minimum wage is therefore higher than the market value of employment, and it costs more to employ people than the benefits of employing them, it puts extra pressure on small businesses, which could force them to close down. Furthermore, minimum wages have two negative effects on the labour force. Firstly, there is an increased risk of using off-the-books illegal labour. This is because illegal labour, surprisingly, doesn't have to pay the minimum wage. Often, illegal immigrant workers are employed unofficially so they can be paid less. This means that there is nothing in place to protect these workers, as, according to the record at least, they don't exist. The minimum wage can also lead to just more general unemployment, as firms cannot afford to keep as many workers employed now that their costs have gone up. This could then also lead to an increase in government expenditure. With a minimum wage, there could be an increase in unemployment and business failures. This means that in the long run, there could be increased government expenditure on welfare and support compared to if the market were allowed to operate freely. There could also be other costs involved. For example, finding workers employed off the books takes time and money. Some also argue that we should not strive for economic equality, but rather equity or fairness. Why pay a low-skilled worker the same base rate as a skilled worker? People who do more deserve to be paid more, and we should not have an arbitrary equal minimum wage just for the sake of it. And then, to round out this side of the debate, let's again come back to the morality of a minimum wage, or rather, the lack thereof. Some argue that no one is entitled to anything in this world. We have to earn what we have, and are not deserving of a minimum amount of money just because someone said so. If you want to make more money, earn it. Moving on now to the comparison. Firstly, on this question of market versus government. Well, some argue that the government is needed to impose a minimum wage because workers cannot bargain enough on their own. However, those disagreeing would say the market is the best determiner of wages, and interfering with it will be harmful. On the question of poverty, some argue that minimum wages reduce poverty because workers have more money and have more to spend than they likely otherwise would have. However, those disagreeing argue that a minimum wage increases poverty because prices go up, affecting the lowest earners, who are the ones the minimum wage is intended to help. Then, on the impact of firms, those supporting the minimum wage argue there is incentives to become more efficient, which has beneficial knock-on effects for society. However, again, those disagreeing argue that a minimum wage is harmful to small businesses because they may be forced to close down due to higher costs. Then, on the impact on the labour force, some point to the fact that a minimum wage creates more security for those who are in work because there is less wage-based competition between workers. However, those disagreeing argue that there is now an increased risk of using off-the-books labour with worse conditions and pay, and there will likely be increased unemployment as firms cannot afford to keep as many workers. Then on the impact to the government, those supporting the minimum wage claim it is good. There is reduced expenditure because more people are in work due to incentives, and therefore there is less government assistance. And there is also more revenue from income tax, VAT, and other means. Those disagreeing would say that there is more expenditure. There is an increased cost of covering unemployment and failing businesses, and there are other costs included, such as finding illegal workers. Then on this question of should we even have equality for workers? Well, a minimum wage would increase equality, both between higher and lower paid workers, as well as between different ethnicities and races. However, those disagreeing argue that equality isn't the goal, or rather shouldn't be the goal, but rather equity should be. Why pay people the same when one does more work than another? We should not strive for equality when it is unfair to those who work harder. And then finally, on the morality of a minimum wage. While some argue that people are entitled to the bare minimum in modern society, including the right to have their most basic needs met in their pay. However, those disagreeing argue that we are not entitled to anything. People have to earn what they get. Overall then, those who support a minimum wage argue that it is essential to protect workers at the bottom from exploitation and ensure they have enough to survive. Those opposing this, however, argue that the minimum wage is counterproductive and harms the very people it was intended to help. The minimum wage is something that is likely here to stay. The question remains, however, how high will it go? Ultimately though, what do you think? Do you think the minimum wage is good or bad? And do you support or oppose increases to the minimum wage beyond the rate of inflation? Also, is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. As always, the aim of this episode has been not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.